Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. At IGPP Expert Talks, for past few months, we have been talking to eminent scholars about the political landscape of the US and discussing the past, present and future of issues that will decide the US presidential race in 2024. US is world's oldest democracy, an economic powerhouse boasting of the strongest military force that claims to be the defender and promoter of freedom, democracy, and human rights. No wonder that the world has interest and stakes in who will be the next president of the superpower that is the US. The trends and issues that dominate the political landscape of the US are bound to have spillover effects all over the world. It is with this idea that as the last ballots are cast in the US today, we are gathered here for a panel discussion with eminent scholars to analyze the trends and issues that dominated and will shape the US presidential election. Joining us today are Professor Manisha Sinha, Ms. Suhasini Haidar, and Ms. Simran Sodhi. Professor Manisha Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a leading authority on the history of slavery and abolition and the Civil War. She was born in India and received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. Ms. Suhasini Haidar is the Diplomatic Affairs Editor of The Hindu, one of India's oldest and most respected national dailies. Prior to this, Ms. Suhasini was Foreign Affairs Editor and primetime anchor for India's leading English news channel, CNN-IBN, where she presented the signature show Worldview with Suhasini Haidar, and was correspondent for CNN International's New Delhi bureau before that. Ms. Simran Sodhi is a Delhi-based journalist and foreign affairs analyst, author of Piercing the Heart: Untold Stories of 2611. She is executive editor of NRIFocus.com and a regular analyst on All India radio program on foreign affairs. Many political analysts have observed that it will be the women's vote that decides the election. And hence, I'm immensely proud and honored to host an all-women's panel for this discussion. I welcome you all to IGPP Expert Talks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, Professor Sinha, as the last ballots are cast today, what is the energy like in the US, and how has the political discourse evolved since the campaign first began to now? I remember when we last met, Joe Biden was still in the race and we were talking about his age. So how has the political discourse evolved since then?
Yes, so of course, as you know, Joe Biden stepped aside and endorsed Kamala Harris. That was really important because you could have had a free-for-all after he decided to step down from the race. And what was amazing was when Kamala Harris stepped into his shoes, she hit the ground running. We know of how she broke Zoom, how the immense enthusiasm for her campaign. It was kind of unprecedented, and she ran a flawless campaign. She had barely over 100 days. Usually, as you know, in the US, the election season is nearly a year long, which is actually quite tiresome. But she had just 100 days, and she has really stepped up to the role. Of course, we know that the polls have tightened in the last few weeks and show a virtual dead heat in the crucial swing states, and even nationally, she's ahead a few points within the margin of error. So I think those polls are something that I would take with a grain of salt because they were completely wrong in 2022. It could go either way still, and I wouldn't ask anyone to be complacent. But the energy on the ground and her ground game is amazing. The internals of her campaign are showing a much brighter prospect. Now, whether that is accurate or not, we don't know, but we know that the Democrats run a pretty professional operation. They're not going to give her polls that just, flatter her or please her, as in the case of Trump, who has surrounded himself with sycophants So, at this point, I think she has a good path to the White House. But, I'm a historian, so I won't predict the future.
Ms. Suhasini, would you agree that this campaign has been a flawless one for Kamala Harris? I mean, this election season, we have repeatedly heard that this is a historic election where democracy is on the line, something that was also said in 2016. Do you think Kamala Harris has been able to avoid the mistakes that Hillary Clinton made in her run? And globally, how the enthusiasm that this election has generated, how is it different from 2016?
Well, when you make the comparisons to 2016, you have to remember that we are once again at that point, or we are not, at least the United States is, because India has had a women prime minister. But the United States is at that point in history when it could possibly get its first woman president. Just as it was in 2016. And it missed that chance, or did not take the opportunity in 2016, and has that opportunity again today. So that is important. The second thing I think that is important is gender has emerged as one of the key factors for Kamala Harris's win or loss. So whether she appeals to the to identity politics in that sense, whether she speaks about her own identity as a woman or as a Jamaican American or as an Indian American extraction person or a Californian or whatever else. She normally only speaks about herself as a middle class, coming from a middle class background. The fact is that gender has been the most interesting part of this campaign. And the reason I say this is, and I'm looking at various polls, but amongst young men, Trump actually has a 21-point lead. But amongst women, amongst young women, Kamala Harris has a whopping 67 to 28%. That's nearly 40-point lead. So women can make the difference if they choose to in this election. A lot will come down to, will Republican women vote for Trump? If they vote at all, could they change their vote, or will they just not show up? As we have seen in certain elections, 2022, women just did not show up to vote for Republican candidates because they were so upset about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And whether Democrat women will come out in the large numbers where they support Kamala Harris or not, I think that's important. I think it's also important to remember that while we are looking forward to the actual day of voting, the American election has more or less been voted on. If you have 160 odd million eligible voters, and say 66 to 70% normally vote in an election, we don't know how many in this one, you already have 82 million people having done early voting, as it's called in the US, then you're only looking at maybe another 40 million odd voting on Tuesday, on November the 5th itself, which means that the decision has already been made about who is actually ahead in this election. And I think that's where we have to take it from, that once that decision is made, how close is that decision going to go? Just looking at those first results that came from Dixierville, they went 3-3, which is really scary. We all know from the polls that it is a bit of a dead heat. So in that sense, it's not unlike 2016, but it is different in the sense that we are seeing the dead heats on both accounts, maybe with a little difference on both the popular vote as well as what we're seeing in terms of the swing states. And it remains to be seen what the third aspect of this, I would say, is of this election, which is different from the past, is having come through the 2020 election. We all know that at least one candidate is not going to accept losing immediately. Mr. Trump has not yet accepted losing the last election itself. We also know that Ms. Harris has a certain tenacity. In 2010, she writes in her memoirs about her election as Attorney General, where she waited 21 days for the final ballot to be counted, even though on the first day her opponent had been elected or had declared himself having won. She waited for those 21 days and eventually won the election. So she has the tenacity to do this waiting out. So I think that's something we must also watch for, that whatever we hear tomorrow, may not be the final result. So not to get too wedded to it, and to expect that there are three outcomes on the ballot today. There's Trump, there's Harris, and there's uncertainty or chaos as the third outcome.
Ms. Simran, this election has been a roller coaster ride. Looking back at the election, what were the key moments this election season that were completely unexpected for you as an outside observer and that you think swayed the election one way or the other?
I think in the beginning, when we had the first debate and we had President Joseph Biden debating Trump, I think we were more or less quite certain that Trump had an edge over Biden. So I think one of the smart things the Democrats did was when they made the decision that Biden would step back and you would have Kamala Harris step in. So that was a little unexpected. One wasn't very sure if she was willing to step up or if the Democrats themselves are willing to step her up. So that I think was a bit of a surprise. And initially we also saw that she had a huge margin. She was leading in the initial weeks when they declared her as the candidate over Biden. I think she got that margin. But I think also we have to remember that she has not been able to maintain that margin, that somehow the race started getting closer and tighter with time, which I think is to do with a lot of questions people have raised. And she has also somewhere not really given too many straight answers to a lot of questions. So I think the good unexpected part they did was push Biden in the background and get Kamala ahead. But I think she also has not been able to maintain that lead, because when she came initially, there was a lot of euphoria that, oh, this is the best thing. She's younger, she's smarter, she'll be able to take on Trump. But the way the race has evolved, it has become much more tighter. And one wonders looking back if she could have done a better job.
Professor Sinha, as Simran just mentioned that, Kamala Harris hasn't been able to maintain that lead. And we know that the race has, as polls show, that race has certainly tightened in the last few weeks. Why is it that Kamala Harris has found it difficult to retain the support of demographic groups for whom just a while back the Democratic Party would have been an obvious choice? And despite that, the Trump campaign got, while it got racist to extreme, Kamala Harris hasn't found that resonance with Black voters, especially Black men. Do you think it's her mixed heritage maybe, or her upbringing as an Indian American, that has diffused her appeal to Black voters? Your mic is on the off, like your audio is off.
I am so sorry. I didn't want to disturb the others. So there are a number of questions there that you asked. And the few things that must be clarified is that Kamala Harris was an unknown quantity virtually till she stepped in. And in the press, whether it was racism, misogyny, or nativism, she has been constantly underestimated when she was vice president. And so she was wary of the mainstream press. And remember that the United States is a two-party system. And it's become virtually like tribalism here, where people will vote the Republican ticket no matter who is at the head of it. Trump, we know, is an extremely flawed candidate. In fact, he has never won the popular vote in the United States. In 2016, he lost it by nearly 3 million votes. Given that Hillary Clinton, ran a very overconfident and lackadaisical campaign, she didn't campaign in the end at all. He still lost in the popular vote. He won the Electoral College through a sliver. We know also that there has been a lot of disinformation, a lot of intervention in American politics to stoke up those divisions, the political divisions, the tribalism of the two-party system, and also racial and other kinds of divisions. Just in this election cycle, we know a lot of Russian disinformation is coming straight. And now the US is a little more prepared to deal with it than it was, I think, in 2016. I think Kamala Harris has, in fact, done the hard work, as she always says, in the campaign. There's this myth that somehow she has not explained herself or her policies. I mean, and it's one of those things that the media really loves to glom on. There'll be a few people who say this, and then it just becomes a self-fulfilling kind of prediction. So for instance, the notion that somehow Trump's economy was better, we know factually that that is completely wrong, that he inherited a roaring economy from Obama and tanked it with his poor COVID response, and that unemployment recession was a total high. And Biden and Harris had to really overcome that deficit. The other thing is, I think there is a lot of misogyny in the United States. There are a lot of men who just cannot imagine women at the head of government, which is rather odd because in India, I think we have status and class has trumped gender, as it has in many other countries where wives, sisters, mothers, daughters take over political power. Britain, of course, has had a record of female prime ministers, some of them rather dismal, showing that gender is not the answer sometimes. I think at this point, Kamala Harris has done something very wise, which is not to overemphasize her gender and her origins, and to really run the campaign as the Democratic candidate. Of course, there's something very historic about her candidacy, especially if she wins. We have seen many many Indians, people of Indian origin, actually be elected to high office all through the West, Britain, Ireland, Portugal. So the US is also late on that. Kamala Harris tends not to emphasize this, mainly because she knows it's kind of a given that her candidacy is historic, both in terms of gender and in terms of, who she is as a woman of color. I think it's kind of interesting how she really emphasizes her Indian American mother. If you see all her speeches, I mean, the father was relatively absent throughout her life. All her speeches are about her mother. And for Indian audiences especially, I would recommend the New York Times article on Shyamlan Gopalan, who was virtually a more outstanding figure than even her daughter, considering everything that she had to face when she came to this country, which was, before even the immigration laws were liberalized as a result of the civil rights movement. So I think Kamala Harris has, in my opinion, actually run a very, very good campaign, considering it was short order. It was, something that she had to do very fast. There will always be some men who will not vote for her simply because she's a woman. And if you look at the kind of Black men, I mean, this has always been portrayed as a big thing. Will Black men vote for her? The kind of men who don't are the kind of men who are associated with, this over-masculinized, toxic kind of presence, especially in the rap music world. There are a lot of these rap stars whose videos and ideas reek of misogyny, who have endorsed Donald Trump. But I don't think they're going to have that much cachet here. I think the real group that we are looking at right now are white women, especially white suburban women. Many of them are actually independents. We forget in this tribalism, we do these polls that are so tight because Republicans will always, say they're going to vote for the Republican candidate and vice versa for Democrats. But the suburban white women who tend to be independent, who voted for Obama, for instance, but who didn't show up for Hillary in 2016, it is really a toss-up what they're going to do. And again, just from the ground game, what I'm hearing from the campaign itself is that white women who actually voted for Trump in greater numbers than they did for Hillary, but then they voted for Biden in greater numbers than they did for Trump in 2020, that they are going to be the most influential group. Because even with Black men, even though, you have 80-90% Black women supporting Kamala Harris, you still have 70-60% Black men supporting Kamala Harris. So I think the overemphasis on them has been somewhat misguided. I am saying the group to watch are suburban white women, and the results will first come out from Virginia. They closed their ballot early. Their polling places close early, 7 p.m., and they do their counting fast. And Virginia is considered a kind of a blue state, but for a long time it was a red state and then a purple state during Obama's time. How does Virginia go, and how do the women in that state go, I think will be a good predictor of how white women are going to be voting in this election.
Ms. Suhasini, is it only the question of gender, or do you think that this election campaign has also opened the fault line of race in the US, which up till now was like the discourse was somewhat disguised when we were talking about culture war and immigration, but Donald Trump and J.D. Vance opened the floodgates to all kind of racism. Has that fault line now been is it out in the open now, and not just between, let's say, the white population and the Black, but also Indian Americans and Blacks and the Hispanic?
Well, I would certainly say, and I'm just viewing this from India, so obviously we see some of the most egregious speeches and the videos that make it viral. I think that the discourse during this campaign has certainly hit a new low. But race has always been a part of US elections. There's never been a time in the last, say, 50 years when there isn't a kind of either a silent kind of a nudge towards race, because, you know, the idea that Democrats traditionally were the base of African Americans and Republicans did not get those votes as much. But I think that in the last decade or so, it's much more out there because firstly, we're in an era of social media. So what people say officially and then what they say when it comes to social media and where they feel more comfortable to speak out, it shows that the discourse is tied around these issues. But I agree with Professor Sinha that, you know, gender has outweighed, in a sense, what we're seeing, because you're either okay with what has been said in terms of women by the Trump campaign, the most recent one being, I will protect women whether they like it or not, or you're completely not okay with it. We do see from an outsider's perspective, that it is so polarized that it is impossible for either side to speak about the other side without using really, really hyperbole and really crude words. I mean, just look at the whole idea of Mr. Biden, a president of our country, talking about voters or supporters of the other side as garbage, or Mr. Vance calling Kamala Harris trash and saying, we're going to take the trash out. As I said, it has hit a new low, but I'm not sure that it is race-related as much as it is in terms of what we have seen so far, a certain polarization and a certain gender kind of insensitive commentary that we've seen. The last point I'll make is that, just as Professor Sinha said, everyone is watching white women in the US to see where they will vote, because other votes seem more committed. In fact, this time everything has been counted up and you're coming to something like 97% for each. 97% together. So, you know, they're both neck and neck at that point. And then you're just looking at the last 2 to 3% and how they are going to shift the vote. I think you have to take into account that in previous elections, there was a sense of grievance. There was a very strong sense of grievance from maybe, white populations that came from not so wealthy cities, or, felt left out in that sense. That was the 2016 election. That's where J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, really told us outside the US what was going on, what the churn was. I'm not sure that's a factor this time. I think it's become, as you said, a lot more in your face. It's become anti-immigration, misogynistic in certain senses. The kind of language even used on the Democrat side, very particularly targeting any supporters of the Trump campaign. I mean, I saw a description, I think, by somebody of the fact that not very intelligent women were part of the Trump support team. So, that kind of rhetoric during a campaign, I think has been unusual for most of us to watch, because normally we're used to a certain amount of what they call political correctness. And we haven't seen it in this campaign.
Talking of hyperbole, Ms. Simran, Donald Trump made a last-ditch appeal to Hindus as late as in Diwali. And how do you read that? Is it simply an effort to appease Indian American voters, or is there more to it, sort of an global meltdown of right-wing ideologies there?
I don't think there's any global meltdown of any right-wing ideology. On the contrary, I think the right-wing ideology over the last decade or so globally, I think, has become much more stronger. And I think it's a phenomena that we see, whether it is the US, India, or any part of the world. I think for various reasons, the left liberal thought is actually going down, and we find people much more hard in their stances and much more right-wing. So I think the fact that Donald Trump made that effort, participated in Diwali, something that Kamala Harris also did as the vice president, her vice president place was all lit up, I think is just a reach out to votes. I don't think there is anything beyond the simple fact that there is a segment today in the US which is Indian American, and both Trump and Kamala would want that percentage of votes coming to them. And so I think it's as simple as that. I think no one would attribute to at any point Trump giving up on his outlandish beliefs at times on whether it is climate change or America first. I think if we see a second Trump term, we are going to see a much stronger, much harder swing to the right wing than we saw in the first term. This will be a Trump who will be back for a second last term. And actually, I think he'll be more hard focused on things that he placed in front of the world during the first term. But still, I think he was a little rough at the edges, not this time around. So no, I don't think there's any letdown as far as the right-wing ideology is concerned. I think it's getting stronger globally. That's my own sense.
Ms. Suhasini, talking of Indian diaspora, let's put the focus onto foreign policy. Kamala Harris has repeatedly claimed that her presidency would not be a continuation of the Biden administration. Has her campaign provided a glimpse of how that might translate into the foreign policy arena? And why is it that unlike Donald Trump, she has remained sort of ambiguous in her reach to Indian American voters?
Certainly, the answer to your first question would really be that, what Kamala will represent or will have to defend is certainly 4 years of the past, because she has been vice president. So it's not like she can completely segue and become a different policy. Maybe some policies will be tweaked a certain amount. We saw her conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, for example, much tougher than Mr. Biden, but clearly not tough enough for her own supporters who threatened to not vote for her as a result of it. So I think on Israel, you may see nuances. On Ukraine, you may see nuances, depending on how much of a budget she's able to push through Congress for Ukraine in the future. I think the difference is going to come if Mr. Trump comes to power when it comes to foreign policy, because we've seen what he has been in the past. And even though the past may be no indicator of what he will be in his second term, it's a pretty good starting point. And that means there will be a lot more disruption. There will be a lot more unexpected tweeting or social media discussions of very, very serious issues. That we might see, as in the past, I used to say, what is Mr. Trump going to leave now? Because in his first term, he walked out of the Iran deal. He walked out of the Paris Climate Accord. He walked out of UNESCO. He walked out of UN a human rights commission. He threatened to walk out of NATO. He threatened to walk out of WTO. There was any number of areas where you saw America retrenching, in a sense, in power. His pullout from Afghanistan, however, that Mr. Biden actually completed it, the fact was it was his deal with the Taliban that paved the way for it, the Doha Accords. So you saw that as a certain Trumpian foreign policy marker. Finally, I think the question is always for India. And as I keep saying, year on year, India and US ties have just grown for the last 25 years. Some years they grow a little faster, some years they grow a little less, but it's bipartisan. It is a year-on-year growth. You always find some new deal or some new area where the two countries are working together. There will be some years where it's a bit slower. You will see certain hiccups like you're seeing right now over the Panun case, for example, and other areas, or that you will see a Democrat administration paying more attention to its concerns over democracy in India or minority rights in India or human rights in India. You won't see that in the Trump administration, but you will see him coming out much more strongly when it comes to Harley-Davidson tariffs. For example, I always point out that while Democrats may have been tougher on the Indian government in many ways, it is Mr. Trump who pulled out India's GSP status in 2019 and never gave that back. It is Mr. Trump who has consistently harangued India as an abuser on the issue of tariffs. So prepare for that. Your final question on the Indian American community and whether Ms. Harris has reached out. Certainly in India, it has been interesting that the first vice president of Indian extraction, and it's not some long distant kind of extraction. Her mother was born and brought up in India. Sorry, excuse me. You see that in terms of, that she has not made one single visit to India as vice president. So there is I don't think it's a distancing from India, but it's certainly not been a priority for her. Will Indian Americans vote for her as a result? I think the latest survey that came out still says 70% of Indian Americans will vote for her, because at least 70% have voted for Democrats every time. And that is without her outreach or anyone else's outreach, simply because it is an immigrant community, and it does feel more comfortable with a Democrat president rather than a Republican one, particularly like Mr. Trump, who's going to be so tough on immigration. And there is a subtle sense that it's not as that you do feel like a minority in the country at that time. So 70%, but it's still less than in the past. Because if you had done that same survey 10 or 15 years ago, I think close to 80% would have said that they would vote Democrat no matter what. What has caused the shift? Have the Republicans been more inclusive? Certainly, you're seeing a lot more Republicans in the party itself who are of Indian American extraction. The Trump White House had quite a few, although the Biden White House probably had more. But you're seeing Indian Americans much more involved in politics. And as a result, when you have more numbers, they will be divided amongst the two major parties there. So I think what you're likely to see is it may not be a vote for Kamala Harris per se from the Indian Americans, but the vote for the Democrats seems to, for the moment at least, still get a majority of Indian American votes.
I think one thing is for sure that we need to keep following Trump's Twitter if he becomes the president, to know about his foreign policies. And speaking of Twitter, I think that one most interesting development that happened is that Elon Musk sort of became the campaign manager of Donald Trump. Professor Sinha, how has Elon Musk entering the campaign, did it have a cascading effect? And I remember that last time we met, we were talking about videos which were being played in slow-mo that really hurt Biden's campaign. So has, in opening the floodgates of misinformation and disinformation, has Elon Musk been able to impact the voters on ground?
Well, as you know, Elon Musk has lost 80% of the stock of Twitter. So he's rich enough to make that investment. And of course, his wealth derives a lot from apartheid South Africa initially, and then from government contracts, even though he keeps railing against the government. So Elon Musk, of course, we know has gone down the deep end, and he's one of the biggest sources of misinformation today in the United States. He has taken on the role of Trump's manager, but he has mismanaged it, right? He had campaign workers in Michigan and Pennsylvania whom he didn't pay, and then he fired them. So to make erratic, a somewhat infantile billionaire like Elon Musk manage your campaign is not a good sign. To have somebody like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is an anti-science, anti-vaxxer, and frankly a little crazy, he literally had worms in his brain, I guess, and say that he's going to manage your health policy is crazy. So what we're going to get with Trump is this complete craziness. And Kamala Harris has been pretty good with emphasizing that. He will jeopardize our alliances in NATO, in Europe. He will jeopardize, and Elon Musk has made it quite clear that he talks to Putin all the time. All these are in violation of the Foreign Act, which prevents American citizens who are not in positions of power to do this, including Trump, who's no longer in the government. So we know also that the Quad has been the alliance that Biden has really pushed for. He is big on these alliances, whether it is to contain China or Russia. And we know that Harris is going to continue that. We must remember that Harris, of course, is of Indian American descent, but she's also of African American descent and identifies also, maybe not so much directly with her father, but with that community. She went to a historically Black college and university like Harvard University, which was founded immediately after the Civil War for freed people from slavery. She belongs to the oldest Black sorority. She attends regularly a Baptist church in California. So she has that part of her identity too. But I have seen actually tremendous enthusiasm for her amongst Indian Americans and South Asians. Part of it is exactly what Suhasini was saying in terms of Trump's misogyny, his nativism, his racism. That has been off the charts this election. What's interesting is that J.D. Vance, who is married to an Indian American, has also dissed the Indian American community. He talked about the weird Indian customs about mothers-in-law coming and taking care of their grandchildren and daughters. He called it weird and strange that she came and stayed with him for so long. And here's a woman, an accomplished professor who took sabbatical in order to do that. So a lot of Indian Americans I know have been a little put off by the Trump-Vance campaign. As Suhasini said, Indian Americans tend historically to vote Democratic for reasons that are quite apparent, because they are here mainly because of the results of the civil rights movement that loosened up immigration laws and allowed Indian Americans to actually immigrate. Before that, there was actually hardly any possibility to do that. I think the reason why maybe Republicans have gotten more Indian Americans is because the Indian American community has become more affluent. There is also, I think, a kind of a right-wing global authoritarianism that we don't talk about much, and that is very much in the Trump campaign with people like Viktor Orban openly interfering and saying Putin, they're openly for Trump. And I think that has also put off a lot of Indian Americans who tend to be more liberal and progressive on these issues. So it's going to be interesting to see if the billionaires make a difference. People like Musk or Peter Thiel, who's also from apartheid South Africa, interestingly, and who basically bankrolled J.D. Vance's Senate campaign because he was actually going to lose. That was for a deeply red state, J.D. Vance just about made it. And it was because of the money that Peter Thiel poured into his campaign. And right now, many of the billionaires can't literally look beyond their noses. They are in for the Trump tax cuts, not realizing that his tariffs might actually tank the economy, which has shown remarkable recovery under the Biden-Harris administration. And I think what's interesting about Kamala is that she is going to continue those economic and foreign policies, but she's going to build on them. So her notion of tax credits for childcare, for the first-time home buyer, for taking care of elderly parents, this is all going beyond even Biden's Build Back Better programs. And that scares the so-called billionaire class. You think of what Bezos did in preventing the Washington Post from endorsing Kamala Harris. They had an editorial ready to print, and he literally intervened. You think of what the owner of the Los Angeles Times did. He did something similar. He's a good friend of Elon Musk. So clearly, after Citizens United, that has allowed a floodgate of dark money into US campaigns, the billionaires have cast their lot, at least some prominent ones. Even the others who are actually for Kamala Harris and have given to her, like Bill Gates and others, the CEO of JP Morgan, they don't want to talk publicly about it because they're nervous about Trump. And in this sense, they're behaving a lot like German businessmen did with the rise of Hitler in the 1930s. They conceded before Hitler was even elected. And so the cowardice, I think, of some of these billionaires when it comes to, and this is not hyperbole, American democracy and the future of the American Republic, as a historian of the United States, I'll tell you, is literally on the balance. In 2026, we will be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of the American Republic. And the question is whether we will be celebrating that or not. And it's not just me, but, historians across the board, academics, intellectuals across the board, economists. You think of some papers like the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. These are not, left-wing organs. Or you think of generals like General Kelly, General Milley, who have said that Trump is a would-be fascist. And as Suhasini said, in his second term, there'll be no guardrails. At this point, he, has gotten rid of the fact that he had to choose a new vice president is telling, because he threatened to hang his last, or his followers threatened to hang his last vice president for not overturning the election results. So at this point, there will be no guardrails for Trump. And he's kind of a crazy guy. He's not pro anything except himself. And maybe he's unpredictable. You never know what he's going to do because his main interest is himself. And the billionaires like Musk, etc., think that they can manipulate him, that they can, be a plutocracy, I guess, instead of a democracy. It would be interesting to see if Trump wins. And at this point, I think I don't give it a 50% chance, even though we are in a two-party system. If he does win by extraordinary, convergence of different things, like what happened in 2016, we are going to get an economy with no regulations, with tariffs. As was said earlier, his policy towards India was, how many Trump towers can I build in India, and how much can I actually prevent? He's talked about countries of the global South in very derogatory ways. And he's an admirer of strong men like Putin and even Xi of China. He keeps talking about how Xi is fantastic. And, you can't imagine Biden with his Quad policy ever saying that. So the anti-China rhetoric is there, but he's an admirer of authoritarianism and anti-democratic regimes across the globe. So, having plutocrats run the economy, even if it means running it to the ground, because that's exactly what the Great Depression of the 1930s was, if we want to go back there, will be a real problem. So I think Musk is for him, but let's see whether democracy trumps plutocracy this time.
I wouldn't ask any of you to comment on what you feel the election result might be tomorrow, because the polls are too tight to call at the moment. But let's hope that the election results are for peace, for human rights, for democracy, and one where women's panel like us can survive and thrive more. Thank you so much for joining us today, all of you. I'm aware you have hectic schedules and you have stories to file, so I won't take any more of your time. Thank you, Professor Sinha. Thank you, Suhasini, Haidar. Thank you, Simran, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Heena.
Thank you.
Heena, thank you.